Welcome, everyone. This is week 2 of our course on People on the Move. And this week I'm joined by Roxani Krystalli, and she is going to tell us a bit about her research this summer. Roxani, do you want to give us some of the details of what you did in the Mediterranean?
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Roxani. I'm delighted to be joining this course alongside Kim. So Kim and I led a team of researchers, including Fletcher School students, on a 4-country study on the financial portfolios of refugees. Our 4 countries of interest were Greece, Turkey, Jordan, and Denmark. And we selected those both because we had good on-the-ground connections that made this research feasible and ethical, but also because they reflect different points on this journey of migration. Some of them are transit countries, some are destination countries. Some have refugees in camps in an organized humanitarian assistance model. Others have urban or dispersed or informally settled refugees. And what we became interested in was this question of money, which is an invisible parameter on refugee journeys. How does the money that refugees have affect the routes that they take, affect their safety and experiences along the way? How do they move cash from their from the point they're fleeing to their point of aspirational destination? How do they store their money? How do they amass more money along the way? And so we ask these types of questions with the aid of our research team in these 4 countries. And today we hope to share some of the key insights with you. This research was possible thanks to very generous support from the Fletcher School, the Hitachi Fund, the Feinstein International Center, CRS in Greece, and GIZ in Jordan, and we're very grateful to them.
And Danish Refugee Council in Turkey.
And Danish Refugee Council in Turkey, indeed. So Kim, one of the things I have found most interesting about our findings from this project is that there's this big misconception that people just flee, that something happens and they leave and they don't prepare in any way, they don't take anything with them. And what we have found is that even when there's urgent threat, quite a bit of preparation goes into these journeys, particularly financial preparation. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, like you, I was surprised as well how much these journeys had been considered way before the actual departure. So in some cases, it was well over a year that people had been planning. And in some cases, it was a month or 2.
Mm-hmm.
But rarely was it instant, even if their flight was instant. So let me give you an example of that. I interviewed some people, a number of families from Afghanistan, and individuals, single men. And the specific example is a dentist who knew that he was under threat. He had been approached by the Taliban for over the better course of a month. And he knew that, in fact, he was being recruited very heavily, mainly because he had skills. And the skills were suturing and medical skills, and that was very much in demand. And so one day they showed up at his clinic, and he realized he had to make a decision right then and there. So he said, "Thank you very much. I'll consider your offer. Give me 2 days." And of course, in that 2 days, it turned out to be 36 hours, he had been able to amass some cash, close down his bank account, and give the money to his parents. And what that did, which is what we were finding out pretty much from everybody from Afghanistan, was that allowed him to hire a smuggler. In no instance did we meet people that had not had the use of a smuggler, and usually many different smugglers.
And can you tell us a little bit what you mean by smuggler in this context? Because I think a lot of people have this image of a smuggler as a villain in these journeys. And while we found that people have suffered harm in the hands of smugglers, they play a very important role, don't they?
An extremely important role. The same people and the same roots that you could say enslave people in human trafficking are also often the same ones that are liberating people. And I want to ask you a question because I know you interviewed a smuggler, and perhaps more than one. But these people are very helpful. They are transporting people from places like Kabul to cities like Quetta, and then moving through Pakistan, across Afghanistan, Iran, into Turkey. And so you might have a network that has 5 or 6 main smugglers, And all of them are working with local passers. And these are people that are literally handing you off from person to person as they perhaps hide you in a bus or in the backseat of a car.
So what I'm hearing you say is that while smugglers might be part of the harm that you experience, and they have indeed hurt some of our research participants, they also facilitate their journeys and their access.
Absolutely.
But that is a paid service, isn't it? So how do you prepare to pay a smuggler?
So that's a great question. And I think Afghanistan perhaps had the most well-worn, tried-out system, which they called the Sarafi system.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where you would go to a local trader or shopkeeper, say in Kabul, in the marketplace. This is probably somebody that you knew or that somebody you knew well, because it's all based on trust. And you would deposit with them, let's say $6,000. And it would be in dollars. And that amount of money would get parsed out over the course of your trip. So, for example, if I arrived safely in Quetta, I would call my shopkeeper, probably give them a code. In most cases, it would be my name plus a code. And then, upon hearing that code, the shopkeeper would know that it was okay to release a portion of the funds to the smuggler.
So another pattern that I'm hearing is that you need to have the funds in advance in order to be able to deposit. And a lot of these families had lived in conflict-affected areas for a very long time. So what are some of the strategies they used to amass funds in order to get it to deposit them? Yes.
Well, they used a variety of strategies. In some cases, they sold jewelry and livestock. Some sold land or sold their homes. Others, for example, in Iran, a woman liquidated her entire shop bit by bit. Literally, equipment by equipment. Each piece was sold. And then finally her own durables, her washer and dryer, etc., until she had the funds she needed, in her case, to take a plane to Turkey. But
and these are both emotional and material costs,
yes,
right? We're often talking about people's dowries, people's wedding rings, status symbols in a particular community.
Yes, so it was in many cases not just a financial transaction. There's a lot of memory and psychological meaning in some of the things that they did sell, including animals. People also borrowed, many tales of borrowing from relatives. And one never knows when those loans are going to get paid back, but if they have to amass $6,000 and they can sell enough for 3 or 4, then they would borrow the rest from family.
And that's a very important parameter of social class. In my experience as well, interviewing families fleeing from the Syrian conflict primarily, in part because we had different interpreters who spoke Farsi or Arabic, we found that if the family didn't have the initial wealth for them to all be able to flee together, they would have to stagger the journeys, which very often leads to family separation. So you usually send an able-bodied older son first, then if you have other children with a preference for males, and then the parents. But we met a lot of people who were from fragmented, separated families because they couldn't afford to finance an entire journey and flight together.
And in some cases, they're expecting those family members that arrive ahead of them to send money to them so that they can make their way. So
tell me a little bit about how that works.
Well, so let's say they have a son that makes it to Germany. He might be going to school, he might be working part-time, and the prospects for a livelihood are a bit better there. So that son would be sending funds back to, it could be Afghanistan, but it could also be partway along the journey.
So Iran, Turkey, Greece.
Exactly.
And how do you send funds?
Well, it depends. Often through informal systems, which would be what is loosely termed the hawala, or the saraf in Afghanistan.
We had a great reading on this week.
We had a reading on that. It's a very simple and clever system where if I wanted to send money to you, I would go down to my shopkeeper, and he or she would place a call to another shopkeeper that would be close to where you lived, and the money would be transferred that simply, and then they would settle their debts accordingly. So lots of use of the hawala. In some cases, if it was to Greece, so from Germany to Greece, people were using MoneyGram and Western Union. But a variety of mechanisms, sending and receiving. And sometimes they're receiving money from their brothers and family back home, people that didn't journey with them. So it's forwards in the journey, backwards in the journey, using formal systems, or we could say supervised systems like Western Union. Some use of banks, but more often than not, the informal system.
And one thing that we have also found in our research is very often the initial sums of money that they amassed are not sufficient to get them to their point of aspirational destination. So these are very iterative, interrupted journeys. You do not leave Afghanistan and don't stop until you get to Germany or Greece or Sweden or Denmark or wherever you're heading. And so some of the reasons why people interrupt their journeys are indeed financial. We heard from a lot of people who said, I had to stop in Turkey for 4 months in order to work. And again, these are decisions that carry risks as well. Work isn't always legal. To the extent that it is legal, it often lands these refugees in very exploitative situations because people are aware of their need. It's often very heavy labor, and the decision to work or the decision to stop very frequently is motivated by health concerns. So for the Afghans, it was people who suffered injuries in the Iranian mountains, or people who had sick children, or people who were injured at some point along the way. The other problem with interrupted journeys, the situation is so fluid, and a lot of the borders closed in the time that it took people to amass money. And so they thought they were just taking a 4-month break, or however long it was, in order to gather the cash they needed to move forward. But in fact, by the time they were able to move forward, the routes had changed, and so they had to rely on often informal, underground, and illegal systems in order to move ahead.
And a lot of times people were carrying cash on their person. So if the trip, say, cost $6,000, which would include smuggling and transportation, you would see people carrying about $1,000 at the beginning of a journey, which, just as you say, might deplete over time and might not be enough.
And we also heard about the lost cash on boats. An enormous part of the journey that has received a lot of coverage are the boats from Turkey to Greece to cross the Aegean. Many of the interviewees we spoke to had videos of neighboring boats flipping over and people losing their belongings, people losing their cash. And particularly in cash transactions, you had situations where people are taken advantage of. So when you paid a bribe in cash or paid a smuggler in cash, you had less leverage than you did in the guarantee system that you described, where payments are released after you have arrived.
And I'm sure you did too, but I spoke with a number of people who had cash forced for them. So either in the form of a robbery or simply people asking them for cash because they were literally like human ATM machines. If they know that you are a refugee or a migrant and you're moving quickly, you are vulnerable. And so people would create special pockets for what they call the bribe money. And the real money might be stitched inside on their clothing or inside their belts, inside their shoes. But they always had some money that they could just hand over. So actually, moving money was quite expensive because risk of loss, just as you're describing, and also forcibly removed.
I think I was struck by how expensive these journeys are. We've heard anything to the order of $6,000, $10,000 to get from Afghanistan to Greece. And the point at which we interviewed people matters. By the time they got to Greece, they still had a journey ahead of them that they needed to finance. And so a question that doesn't really get asked is, what do refugees spend money on? And how can they use the money that they have saved to finance these journeys? And I think one of the challenges here is political, where first of all, they don't have a livelihood. They don't have a predictable source of livelihood on the move. And secondly, they're afraid that if they indicate that they have any money whatsoever, they will be ineligible for any forms of humanitarian assistance or other assistance that might be coming their way. And so the incentives are doubly skewed against them.
It's true, and some populations have priority even when it comes to cash assistance. We certainly saw that
in Greece.
in Greece, and so people are trying to figure out, all right, what's the high priority population, and how can I match my identity to that? So there's a lot of, I guess you could say, trying to game the system because they have very real and pressing needs, and every bit of the cash they get counts. It all matters.
Absolutely, and I'll be discussing some of those anecdotes, the ideas of the politics of humanitarianism and hierarchies of need in week 4 coming up. But I think what you're raising are these questions of identity, not just identity in terms of how do you prove it, but also political questions of identity and money, questions of gender, questions of social class. And so I think it might worth prefiguring some of these. So how do you think social class affected the nature of these journeys?
Well, I think it very much affected their choice. I think gender did as well. We met some women that were traveling alone, had been separated from their families, and would try to stick together as best they could, so for protection reasons. But certainly their class and social status back home affected the routes that they took and the kind of arrangements they were able to make. So in Syria, one of the biggest problems turns out to be traveling from ISIS-controlled areas to non-ISIS control areas, not just across the border to Turkey, but actually traveling within Syria itself. And the best way to do it is to try to go by car and have it a secure vehicle, and that's very expensive. And not everybody can afford to do that.
Life jackets were another big example for families of a higher social class where they were able to guarantee a boat with life jackets for themselves and their children. And again, even if you struck that deal, it wasn't always followed through in the moment. And on the gender front, I think single men is a narrative that we kept hearing, where single men were not a priority for humanitarian assistance, for cash distributions. And the general counterterrorism narrative of we cannot be funding single men crossing borders has really affected the experience of vulnerable single men that are also in the mix.
Exactly. And they experienced their journeys very differently than, let's say, a mother of 3 who's 35 years old.
Or a family.
Or a family.
Which was the standard model that we were able to interview.
Exactly.
Well, thank you, Kim. I have learned a lot through our discussion, and I look forward to hearing what our participants have to say in the discussion forums.
I am too, and I'm excited about some of the reading we dug up, and I also think our participants might be adding their own. So we look forward to that and to discussing our topic this week with all of you.
We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thanks.